The death of a little boy would have a small town shaken to its core, but not for the first time. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. Aroma Park, Illinois is a small town located in Kankakee County, Illinois. On August 7, 1995, Micah Moulton would give her 10-year-old son permission to go to the boat launch on Kankakee River. Christopher's mother would remind him that he needed to be home by 5 p.m., and that was a strict curfew. Christopher was described as a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy with unforgettable dimples. And not only was he adorable, but he was well-mannered. He very much listened and respected his mother. So when she said, "Christopher, you need to be home by 5, he knew that he did, in fact, need to be home by 5 p.m. that evening. When Christopher left to go to the boat launch that day, he was wearing blue shorts, a green patterned t-shirt, high-top tennis shoes, and Ninja Turtle underwear. Unfortunately, Christopher would not return home by 5 p.m. as his mother had told him to. So his mother began to look for him right away. This wasn't like Christopher. He really paid attention to the time and he respected her rules. So she began to worry. Almost immediately, she was concerned for the well-being of her son. She was completely panicked. She didn't even have a second to be angry for him missing curfew. She just knew in the pit of her stomach that something was wrong. After a few hours of searching for Christopher with no success, she did call the police, and they launched a search into the missing 10-year-old boy. The small town was rocked by Christopher's disappearance. The town was a relatively safe place to live. They didn't really deal with any sort of crimes like this. And Christopher seemingly vanished. Nobody knows what happened to him, and the search was coming up with nothing. But eventually, clues would begin to pop up. Members of the search team would find some of Christopher's clothing and bicycle along the river. While dragging the river on August 8th, they would find one of Christopher's shoes floating in the river at the boat launch. The same day, Christopher's bicycle had been recovered, but it was found across the river in a wooded area. During the morning of August 9th, 1995, Christopher's other shoe was located downstream. As police are searching for Christopher, they're also interviewing anybody that was at the boat launch that day. They were able to find a witness, and they brought the witness in, and they had them kind of compile this compository sketch of the person last seen with Christopher. And this sketch would lead investigators to their first big break in the case. The witness's sketch was widely circulated in the media, and one person at home that day saw that sketch, and they instantly knew this looked like somebody they had known quite personally. Richard Huffman would contact the police and say he believes he knows who this person is. And he told the police, "I believe this is a man known as Timothy Buss. The only problem is, I think he's still in prison." So how did Richard Huffman recognize the sketch of this man? On May 21st, 1981, 5-year-old Tara Sue Huffman was heading to a friend's house for a play date. Tara Sue was walking to the Smith's house, which was just right down the road from her own home. But it turns out, Tara Sue never made it to her play date, and the 5-year-old seemed to have vanished. Tara's mother would call the Smith home at around 2:30 p.m. that day and say, "Hey, can you send Tara home? It's time for her to come home." Confused, the Smith residents said, "Tara never came here today. We haven't seen Tara." Tara's mother was incredibly confused when she hung up the phone, so she went over to the Smith home thinking maybe Tara arrived there and the girls were playing outside and they just hadn't seen her. But when she got there, Tara was nowhere to be found. Tara's family would search for the little girl for about 2 hours before they contacted the police. Unfortunately, a little after 7 p.m. that day, Tara's body was found in a landfill. The landfill was about 2.5 miles away from Tara's home. She was nude except for her top, which had been pulled up, and there was a stick in her rectum. It turns out a 13-year-old boy was the one to find Tara Sue Huffman. He had been searching in the landfill next to another man. They hadn't gone to the landfill together, but they somehow ended up in the same area, and they knew that they were searching for the same little girl. When this 13-year-old boy discovered the body, he called for the other searcher and said, "Come help me lift her body out of the pit." But the other searcher, who was a grown man, said, "No, you need to leave it there, stay here, guard the scene, make sure no other kids see it. I'm gonna run over and get the police." And so he left, he got the police, and obviously the police came and kind of sectioned off the scene and began their investigation. At this point, the grown man and the 13-year-old boy were asked to come to the police station, not because they were necessarily in any trouble, but police had to do their due diligence and question the pair. The 13-year-old boy and his father would go to the police station to give his statement, and this boy's name was Timothy Buss. Investigators would begin by asking Timothy about his day. What did he do? Where did he go? Was he in school? And Timothy would kind of give them the play-by-play. On that day, Timothy didn't go to school, and it turns out because his family couldn't afford to send him on the field trip that his classmates were going on, so they just kept him home instead. Timothy had been staying at his aunt's house, which was next to the Smith home. He had planned to help a neighbor that lived next to the Smiths wash their car. After helping the neighbor wash the car, he would head home, have some lunch, and watch TV until around 2:30 that day. He said after he was done watching TV, he decided to head over to his friend's home. Timothy would say that he left his friend's home and got back to his aunt's house at around 3 p.m. that day, and then his grandmother came and picked him up. When he arrived at his grandma's house, he played softball until around 6:30, and then he was brought back to his aunt's home. When he arrived back home, he noticed there was some commotion, so he went over to the Smith residence and asked what was happening, and they told him that Tara Sue Huffman had gone missing. So he joined in on the search for her. Earlier in that interview, Timothy said that he had gone to a friend's house for about 30 minutes before his grandmother picked him up. It turns out the detective interviewing Timothy was a close friend of the family that Timothy mentioned. And so the detective would say, "Wait, you went to whose house? And what did you do when you got there?" And Timothy would tell him, and he would clarify for the detective, and he said, "Yeah, we got there. We just kind of stood around and talked, and then I went back to my aunt's home." So the detective would ask him one more time, and he'd kind of repeat what Timothy said, and he's like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I did." But the officer knew that couldn't be true because he was good friends with the parents of that child, and that child had gone to Florida to live with his father. And as detectives are focusing in on Timothy and they're listening to his story, they notice he has some scratches on his face. And then they're kind of observing his clothing as he talks, and it looks like there's blood stains. Detectives are now wondering if the person that murdered the 5-year-old little girl is sitting in front of them. As Timothy is being interviewed, a witness would call the station, and they said, at around 2:30 p.m., I got a knock on my door, and it was this younger boy. And this boy asked if he could use the wagon that was in my yard, my children's wagon. And she would ask the boy, "Why do you need a wagon?" The boy would tell the woman that he had a barrel full of junk because he had been cleaning out his garage, and he wanted to haul it to the landfill. She would note that the boy looked very nervous and that he really couldn't make eye contact with her. And then she would describe what he was wearing. She said that he was wearing jeans, a white t-shirt, and a baseball cap, the same clothes that Timothy had been wearing when he came in for the interview. She would also note that the boy had very distinguished lips. And as the detectives are hearing this, they know that Timothy has very distinguishable lips. She would say that she gave the boy permission to use her children's wagon, but she didn't notice when it was dropped back off. She said later she looked out in her yard and the wagon was there. And she hadn't thought much of it until Tara went missing. Police would ask her to come down to the station and give a formal statement. As this new witness is walking through the police station, she notices Timothy, who's there for his interview, and she instantly knows that's the boy that borrowed the wagon that day. Detectives would soon realize that Timothy's grandmother worked at a place that had those barrels and had in fact given one or two of those barrels to Timothy's grandmother. One of those barrels had been at the crime scene, and Tara's blood was on that barrel, and a palm print that belonged to the 13-year-old boy, Timothy Buss. The stain on his clothing that police noticed during the interview, it was Tara's blood. Tara had died between 1:30 and 2:30 p.m. from a single blow to the back of her head. Eventually, Timothy was charged for her murder, and he was charged as an adult. He was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. So what about that sketch from the Christopher Meyer case? As the Christopher Meyer case is unfolding and the media is flashing this sketch around, this witness sketch, the Huffman family instantly recognizes it, although it doesn't look much like Timothy Buss at all. For some reason, they thought he was still in prison, although he had been released 2 years prior on good behavior. So they would contact the police and they'd say, "Listen, this does look like Timothy Buss." And the police would say, "Interesting, we'll look into it." And they soon realized that Timothy Buss was out of prison. and he was living only a few miles away from them. 8 days after Christopher went missing, his body was found in the woods. It looked like the murderer did try to bury the boy, but there was really only a dusting of dirt over him, and his foot was still sticking out, and a piece of plywood was put over the boy. Christopher had been sexually mutilated and stabbed 50 times. This little boy just went out to enjoy a lazy, warm summer afternoon and was found brutally murdered. On the day Christopher went missing, there were quite a few witnesses that came forward. One witness would say that they saw Christopher talking to a man who was significantly older. He had dark hair and a mustache. They said the man was wearing a turquoise tank top and cut-off jeans. This witness did talk to the man at one point, and this man said that he had just returned from Florida. He had been visiting some family, but he did have family in this area. This witness would say that he did notice the man's tackle box, and inside the tackle box seemed to have lures that were just too big for the fish there, and a fillet knife. Unfortunately, this witness was unable to give a positive identification during a lineup, but he did say that Timothy Buss looked similar to the man he had talked to that day. A 15-year-old would testify that around 4 p.m. on that day, he did see Christopher. Christopher had been walking out of the woods, he came down, and he washed his shoes off in the river. Christopher would grab his bike, and the 15-year-old said, "Why don't you just wash your bike off in the river?" But Christopher said, "I have to get home, I have to be home by 4:30 p.m., and then took off with his bike. The 15-year-old witness would say at one point he did see Christopher talking to a man in a car, and then Christopher ran and grabbed his bike, which is when the witness was talking to Christopher, and the man in the car was kind of circling the parking lot and then drove away. And then as Christopher was leaving, he seemed to head in the same direction as that man. On August 10th, that 15-year-old boy was brought to the police station. As they're interviewing Timothy Buss, they have his car in the parking lot, and they have 25 to 30 other cars there. So they asked the 15-year-old boy, "Can you find the car that you saw?" And out of those 25 or 30 cars, the 15-year-old boy was able to identify Timothy Buss's car. There are quite a few other witnesses that came forward and placed Timothy Buss at the boat launch that day and around the surrounding areas around the time that Christopher had been there. They had placed Timothy Buss under surveillance, and they were following him around prior to bringing him down for questioning. And one detective would follow Timothy Buss to his motel, where he got out and threw muddy boots into the dumpster. The detective would get out of the car, he'd grab the boots, put them in a plastic bag, and turn them over for evidence. So when police were able to get in contact with Timothy Buss, they said, "You need to come down to the police station, we have to question you, but please drive your car." So he did what police said, and he brought his car there. And while he's being interviewed, they got a search warrant for his car. Dr. Larry Blum, who performed the autopsy on Christopher, would note the extent of his injuries. Dr. Larry Blum found a contusion to Christopher's jaw and 52 stab wounds and cuts on the body. These were primarily to the chest, abdomen, and back. Dr. Blum would say that these stab wounds were made by a single knife that was maybe long and thin, and that knife could have been a fillet knife. He also said that this knife could have been used to remove Christopher's genitalia. He would also point out that none of those stab wounds would lead immediately to Christopher's death. So we can assume that Christopher had a very long and painful death and eventually bled out. When police got the search warrant for Timothy's car, they did note in the trunk there was fishing poles, a tackle box, but they couldn't find the fillet knife that witnesses had said this man was wearing on the day that Christopher went missing. There was blood on the carpet of the trunk, along with other items in the trunk that day. There was hair recovered from the passenger seat in Timothy's car, and that belonged to Christopher. In the trunk of Timothy's car, they also found a hammer, and the claw of the hammer was packed with dirt and soil. And a forensic expert was able to identify the dirt from the claw of that hammer and match it to that in the gravesite of Timothy. And the boots that had been thrown out at the motel, they were able to match those boots to a partial print left at the gravesite. There's also blood found on the boots that had been dumped at the motel, but tests couldn't determine if it was human or if it had been animal blood. Eventually, Timothy was found guilty for murdering Christopher. The community really was outraged and shocked because this now 27-year-old man had previously murdered a little girl when he was 13, and he was let out of jail, and he did it again. Timothy Buss was born in October of 1967 in Texas. He was the oldest of 4 siblings, and they would eventually move to Illinois. His parents would divorce in September of 1973, and when they divorced, apparently Timothy's mother got remarried and had a whole new family and kind of forgot about her first family. She didn't have anything to do with her children, apparently. A psychiatrist would say that Timothy Buss felt rejected by his mother because she remarried, had another family, and ultimately forgot about him. After the murder of Tara Sue, he was charged as an adult, but he went to a juvenile center first. At his 21st birthday, he was transferred to an adult prison. And as a teenager, at least twice, he did try to commit suicide. In a 1982 report, a psychiatrist for the corrections department would write, "He hates everything and everybody without prejudice, and he is ready, willing, and able to vent his spleen on any available object." While in prison, Timothy Buss would earn his GED. He took classes in auto body repair, he took welding classes, he worked as a janitor, a laundry worker, and other things. He was pretty much a trusted prisoner. He did have access to do things to keep him busy. But while in prison, he never received any treatment. He was released in 1993 and he was going to go back to his hometown, but apparently he received threats, so he moved to Florida for the time being. Many experts believe that sex offenders can be controlled, but not cured. And they say that the very small percent of them that do rape and murder are considered the most difficult to treat. An expert would say they are generally a very angry bunch. A child of 13 who does that must have been so traumatized himself, it's really scary. Timothy Buss did have a turbulent childhood. I mean, his parents split up. To my knowledge, he was kind of just thrown around from family member to family member. His father didn't really focus on parenting, and Timothy was just left to his own devices. On top of feeling abandoned by his own mother, he was very resentful and angry. Timothy Buss's neighbor would say that this wasn't the man that she knew, though. She had been living next to Timothy Buss for quite a few months. This woman said that she trusts Timothy Buss so much that she would let her 3 children, aged 7, 9, and 11, go with Timothy Buss on fishing trips. And she'd let them run errands with him. She really felt safe and comfortable with Timothy Buss in her life. Timothy Buss would tell his neighbor that he was convicted of murdering a 5-year-old, except he told her that he wasn't guilty and he was innocent and that he was locked up for a crime somebody else committed. And she believed him. She would go on to say, "He seemed sad about it, but anytime I asked him about it, he'd talk about it." David Buss, Timothy's father, would testify at his trial. He basically testified and said that he was a terrible father and he was partially to blame for how his son turned out. He would say, "I didn't pay attention to the kids like I should have. I didn't think that much of the kids. I thought more of myself." He would even admit to beating Timothy with a belt. Eventually, Timothy Buss was sentenced to death, but that was commuted to a life sentence, so he is still in prison today, where he very much belongs. This case is incredibly disheartening because you have a 13-year-old boy who murdered a 5-year-old girl. He was sentenced as an adult to 25 years in prison, and then he was released. And as an adult, he again murdered another child. Many people do feel like this could have been prevented, but many people do argue that in the 80s in Illinois, they didn't have a juvenile sex offender program or really any sex offender program that would obviously give all these telltale warning signs about the fact that he was probably going to perpetrate another crime against a child. But the facts are Timothy Buss killed once at the age of 13 and then again at the age of 27. And now he'll never have a life outside of those prison walls. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to it. In the meantime, check out some other videos on my channel while you wait for the next upload, and I'll see you then.